I have managed to go my entire adult life without ever needing a tube bender. But for the project I'm currently working on, I needed to be able to roll a 1/2-inch tube for a specific radius. Rather than buy a specialized tool that I might only use once, I wanted to see if I could make one out of some of the scrap plywood and hardware that I had kicking around. I figured that if this works, it really only needs to work once. For my tube roller, I needed to have a die circle and a rolling circle. I first made the rolling circle, which does not need to be any specific diameter, though I did settle on a little over 3 inches. I used some 3/4 inch thick Baltic birch plywood, which I doubled up to make a full 1.5 inch thick disc. First, I trued up the disc on the lathe and cut holes for the bearings. After this, I needed to cut the channel where the tube would go while it was rolling. I used a thin spacer to push this roller a little further out away from the chuck. The channel I'm about to cut needs to be about 40% of the tube cross-section. Without that spacer, the chuck would have gotten in the way of the turning gouges. I took my time and stopped to check often to make sure I was getting both the right shape and depth. The groove probably could have ended up a little deeper, but I didn't have any gap, which was my biggest goal. For the die roller, I made it much the same way. Because my tubing will be bent around this roller, it was important to make sure that the radius of this circle matches the radius of the tube I'm looking for. Because this disc is a lot wider than what would fit in the lathe chuck, I added a temporary hub. I found the Baltic birch reacted much better to traditional lathe gouges than the carbide tools. I'm not an experienced enough turner to understand exactly why, but it may have been that my carbide inserts were just getting dull. Like with the other disc, I took my time and formed this groove as accurately as I could. It didn't come out perfect, but it was definitely close enough. After all, this is a tube bender made out of scrap wood. To set the center for the bearing holes, I drilled a small hole straight through the middle. I removed the temporary hub and drilled the bearing holes on the drill press. Somehow, one of the bearing holes did end up being a little off-center. I was able to solve this problem by just drilling the correctly placed hole all the way through. I had enough spare bearings on hand that I was able to fill the entire center with them. I then turned my attention to making the handle. I needed to make sure the bolt holes between the two axles were perfectly spaced. I didn't want the tubing to end up being crushed between the wheels, but I also didn't want there to be too much play. And for something that's intended to be a single-use tool, I don't really know why I bothered to round these corners off, but here we are. My spacing ended up bang on with a really nice fit for the tube between the two rollers. I cut up some more of my doubled up plywood scraps to be able to fill the gap between the two halves of the handle. At this point, I finally started giving some thought of how I would hold the tube stationary while it was being rolled. I needed to add a straight solid piece that would come tangentially off the die roller. I used a rabbiting bit on the router table to cut a somewhat crude mortise into the die roller. It's ugly, but it actually fit pretty tight. I used a long screw to strengthen the joint, but if there's a single part of this contraption that's going to fail, this would be it. That mortise should have been much deeper. If I find I need to use this more in the future, I'll probably remove this piece, cut a much deeper mortise, and get a larger glue surface area. To hold the tube in place while bending, I cut a V into a piece of plywood. This part was then sandwiched between some scrap 1/2-inch plywood. I cut a relief so that the tube would be supported as close to the roller die as possible. As it turned out, I ended up with a slight gap between the tube and the bender. A small piece of scrap walnut filled this gap perfectly. For my first test, I used a piece of aluminum tubing. I mounted the bender in my shop-made vise and tried it out. Aside from slipping in the vise, it worked perfectly. The tubing bent perfectly without being deformed or crushed in any way. Next, I tried steel tubing. This time I reoriented the bender in the vise and it held much better. It took a little bit more effort, but again, the tubing bent perfectly. So there you have it. You can make a tube bender out of plywood. Would you want to? That's up to you. Overall, I'm happy with how this performed, and I'm happy I didn't have to buy a tool that I probably only would use once.